We are taught that sovereign nations control their own resources, that oil beneath a country's soil belongs to that country, that international law protects national assets. But this is the version they teach in schools to maintain the illusion of sovereignty. The truth is that in January 2026, the United States seized the world's largest oil reserves in a single operation, and the mechanism they used to take Venezuela's $17 trillion worth of oil is now the template for controlling resources anywhere on Earth. This is the story of the raid that made sovereignty obsolete. To understand what happened in Venezuela, you need to understand what those oil reserves actually mean. Venezuela sits on 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia, larger than the entire Middle East combined. At $57 per barrel, those reserves are worth $17.3 trillion. That is more than the annual GDP of every country on Earth except the United States and China. That is 4 times the size of Japan's entire economy. But here's what makes Venezuela different. This oil is not conventional light crude. It is extra heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt, dense, viscous, expensive to extract. The technology to refine this oil exists in only 2 places, Texas and Louisiana, which means Venezuela's $17 trillion of oil is worthless without American refineries. And in 2007, Venezuela forgot this fact. Hugo Chavez was president. Oil prices were above $100 per barrel. Venezuela was flush with cash. Chavez decided he did not need American oil companies anymore. On May 1, 2007, he nationalized Venezuela's oil industry. He seized the assets of ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and every other foreign oil company operating in the country. He kicked them out. He took their equipment, he took their facilities, he took their decades of investment. The companies filed lawsuits. International arbitration courts awarded them billions in compensation. Venezuela refused to pay. Chavez believed he had won. He had reclaimed Venezuela's oil for the Venezuelan people, but he had made a critical miscalculation. The oil was still in the ground, and without American technology, American refineries, and American markets, that oil stayed in the ground. Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, became a political tool. Chavez installed loyalists with no technical expertise. He drained PDVSA's profits to fund social programs and military spending. Skilled engineers fled the country. Equipment broke down, refineries crumbled, oil fields flooded. In 1998, Venezuela produced 3.5 million barrels per day. By 2018, production had collapsed to 700,000 barrels per day. When Chavez died in 2013, Nicolas Maduro took power. The collapse accelerated. By 2024, Venezuela was producing less than 1 million barrels per day. A country with the world's largest reserves was exporting less oil than Ecuador. The economy imploded. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency. Millions fled. Those who remained faced food shortages, power blackouts, and total economic collapse. But Maduro stayed in power. Backed by Russia, backed by China, and critically, still controlling $17 trillion worth of oil, the United States had imposed sanctions. Financial sanctions. Oil sanctions. Individual sanctions. Individual sanctions. But sanctions are just paper. They did not remove the oil. They did not remove Maduro. Until January 2026. On the night of January 2nd, United States Special Operations Forces conducted a raid on Caracas. The operation was surgical. No warning. No negotiation. Delta Force operatives landed at Maduro's compound. They captured the Venezuelan president and his wife Cilia Flores. Within hours, Maduro was on a plane to the United States. Within days he appeared in federal court in Miami facing drug trafficking charges. President Trump addressed the nation. He said Venezuela had stolen American oil, stolen American assets, cost the United States billions of dollars. He said American oil companies would now fix Venezuela's infrastructure and restart production. But this was not a humanitarian intervention. This was a resource seizure, and the mechanism had been prepared for months. Within 48 hours of Maduro's capture, the United States Coast Guard seized 2 oil tankers in international waters. The first was the Bella One, later renamed the It had been sanctioned in 2024 for smuggling oil for Hezbollah. The ship fled across the Atlantic to avoid capture. The Coast Guard tracked it for 2 weeks. British forces provided surveillance. When the Marinera reached waters south of Iceland, 5,000 miles from Venezuela, Coast Guard cutters moved in. The ship's crew claimed it was Russian-flagged. A Russian warship and submarine appeared as escorts, but they did nothing. The United States boarded the Marinera and seized control. The crew was arrested. The ship was towed to American custody. The second ship was the Sophia, a stateless tanker operating in the Caribbean with its transponder turned off. It was loaded with 2 million barrels of Venezuelan crude. U.S. forces intercepted it in international waters. The crew surrendered without resistance. These were not isolated incidents. These were demonstrations. The message was clear. Any ship carrying Venezuelan oil anywhere in the world can be seized. Any crew can be arrested. Any cargo can be confiscated, and the legal justification was already in place. In 2019, the first Trump administration had designated PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, as a sanctioned entity. Trading with PDVSA became illegal for anyone in the U.S. financial system, but the sanctions went further. The Treasury Department designated dozens of oil tankers as blocked property, ships owned by shell companies, ships registered in Comoros or Panama or Liberia. The so-called shadow fleet, about 1,000 tankers worldwide that transport sanctioned oil from Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. And here is the mechanism that makes this unprecedented. Once a ship is designated as blocked property, it becomes subject to U.S. jurisdiction anywhere on Earth, not just in American waters. Anywhere, international waters, foreign ports, it does not matter. If a U.S. court issues a warrant, the Coast Guard can seize that ship 5,000 miles from the United States, with or without the flag state's permission. With or without international law's approval, this is the new reality. Resource control through financial and maritime dominance. But the raid was only step one. Within 72 hours, the Trump administration announced a new policy. The United States would now control the distribution of Venezuela's oil globally, not just embargo it, control it. The Energy Department issued a statement. The only oil transported in and out of Venezuela would be through approved channels, consistent with U.S. law and national security interests. Translation: if you want Venezuelan oil, you buy it through American companies at American prices under American supervision. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spelled it out. The interim authorities in Venezuela understand the only way they can move oil, generate revenue, and not have economic collapse is if they cooperate and work with the United States. This is not regime change, this is regime management. Venezuela still legally owns its oil. The government still exists, but every barrel that leaves Venezuelan soil now requires American approval, and the enforcement mechanism is global. At least 30 oil tankers fled Venezuelan waters in the week after Maduro's capture. Satellite tracking showed them scattering across the Caribbean and Atlantic. But they have nowhere to go. Every major port requires insurance. Every insurance company requires access to U.S. financial systems. Any company that touches sanctioned Venezuelan oil risks being cut off from dollars. This is the petrodollar mechanism applied to physical commodities. Control the payment system, control the resource. China is Venezuela's largest customer. 81% of Venezuelan oil exports go to China. In November 2025, Venezuela exported 952,000 barrels per day. 778,000 of those barrels went to Chinese refineries. China has spent years building alternative payment systems. The CIPS network, yuan-denominated trade, direct currency swaps with Venezuela. None of it matters, because Venezuelan oil still needs to be transported, and transportation requires ships. Ships require insurance. Insurance requires dollars. Dollars require American approval. China can offer Venezuela billions in credit. But if Venezuelan tankers cannot move without being seized in international waters, the credit is worthless. This is economic encirclement, and it extends beyond Venezuela. Russia and Iran operate the same shadow fleet, the same sanctioned tankers, the same payment evasion schemes. In December 2025, Ukraine began attacking Russian oil tankers in the Black Sea. Drones striking ships carrying Russian oil to India and China. The United States seizure of Venezuelan tankers raises the stakes. Now both Ukrainian drones and American warships threaten the shadow fleet. For China, this is strategic catastrophe. More than 25% of China's oil imports come from sanctioned suppliers, Venezuela, Russia, and Iran combined. Beijing has spent decades diversifying its energy suppliers precisely to avoid dependence on any single source. Now all three of its alternative suppliers are under simultaneous pressure. The Saudi route requires passage through the Strait of Hormuz, which the U.S. Navy controls. The African routes are longer and more expensive. Domestic production cannot cover the gap. China imports 10 million barrels per day. If the United States can interdict even 20% of sanctioned imports, China faces energy shortages, and energy shortages mean industrial slowdowns, which means economic recession, which means political instability. This is the strategic objective. Not just controlling Venezuela's oil, controlling the global flow of oil to America's primary competitor. But there is a second objective. Venezuela's oil is worthless in the ground. To monetize $17 trillion of reserves, you need infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, ports, power plants. All of it is broken. Decades of corruption and mismanagement destroyed what Chavez had seized. The United States has estimated that restoring Venezuela's oil production to 2 million barrels per day would require $180 billion in investment. President Trump said American oil companies would spend billions to fix the infrastructure. But here is what that actually means. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips never received compensation for the assets Chavez seized in 2007. International arbitration awarded ExxonMobil $9.4 billion. ConocoPhillips was awarded $8.7 billion. Venezuela never paid. Now those companies have leverage. The interim Venezuelan government needs investment. But before any American company invests $1, they will demand payment for past seizures, which means Venezuela's first $100 billion of oil revenue will go to repaying debts from 2007, before a single barrel is produced for Venezuela's benefit. This is debt trap mechanics applied to natural resources. Venezuela becomes a production zone. The oil flows. The revenue flows, but it flows to American companies first. For how long? President Trump said the United States would administer Venezuela indefinitely. Not 1 year, not 5 years, indefinitely. Which means this is not temporary control. This is permanent structural change, and the legal justification is already established. Trump claimed that Venezuela seized American assets in 2007, that seizure was illegal under international law. Therefore, the United States has the right to recover those assets. The mechanism is restitution. Venezuela stole. America is taking it back. But the amount Venezuela allegedly stole is measured in billions. The amount America is taking is measured in trillions. This is not restitution. This is annexation. Economic annexation without territorial conquest. And the precedent is now set. Any country that nationalizes American assets faces the same mechanism. Sanctions, isolation, regime removal, resource seizure, not through invasion, through financial tools, maritime interdiction, and proxy forces. Venezuela is the proof of concept, but the implications extend further. Mexico nationalized its oil in 1938. Brazil nationalized Petrobras. Norway created Equinor. Dozens of countries have state-owned oil companies that control their resources. All of them are watching what happened in Venezuela. The lesson is clear. Sovereignty over resources requires the power to protect them. Legal ownership means nothing if you cannot prevent seizure. And in 2026, only one country has the financial and military infrastructure to project power globally. China cannot intercept tankers 5,000 miles from its coast. Russia cannot blockade the Caribbean. Europe has no independent energy enforcement capability. Only the United States can designate a ship as contraband in one jurisdiction and seize it in another. Only the United States can cut countries off from dollar clearing and cripple their ability to sell resources. This is the new mechanism of control, not territorial empire, financial and maritime empire. And $17 trillion of Venezuelan oil just demonstrated how it works. But here's what they do not tell you. Venezuela is not unique. Venezuela is the template. The world has approximately 1.7 trillion barrels of proven oil reserves at $60 per barrel. That is $100 trillion. And every barrel of that oil trades in dollars, moves on ships insured by Western companies, flows through payment systems dominated by American and European banks, which means the United States does not need to invade countries to control their resources. It just needs to control the systems that turn resources into money. This is what happened in Venezuela. Not regime change. System capture. Maduro was removed, but PDVSA still exists. The oil field still exists. Venezuela still legally owns its reserves. What changed is access. Without American approval, that oil cannot move. Without American refineries, that oil cannot be sold. Without American financial systems, that oil cannot generate revenue. Legal ownership without operational control is meaningless. And this mechanism is now deployed against every country that challenges American primacy. The question is not if it will be used again. The question is where. In 2026, the United States controls Venezuelan oil. China's largest alternative supplier is compromised, but Iran produces 3 million barrels per day. Russia produces 10 million. Together, they supply 1/3 of China's imports. If the same mechanism is applied to Iran and Russia, China loses access to 15 million barrels per day, half its imports. Without those imports, China cannot power its industrial base, its economy contracts, its military capabilities degrade, its challenge to American dominance ends. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is official policy. The Trump administration has stated explicitly that sanctioned oil will be interdicted globally. Every ship carrying Russian oil, every tanker moving Iranian crude, every vessel transporting Venezuelan barrels, all subject to seizure, all subject to American jurisdiction. The raid on Caracas was not about Maduro, it was about demonstrating capability. The seizure of $17 trillion in oil reserves was not about Venezuela, it was about establishing precedent. And the precedent is this. In the 21st century, resource sovereignty requires financial and military power to enforce it. Without that power, ownership is irrelevant. The United States seized Venezuela's oil not by invading, not by conquering, but by controlling the systems that make oil valuable. And every country with resources is now calculating whether they have the power to prevent the same fate. The raid that destroyed $17 trillion in sovereign assets was not an anomaly. It was the blueprint.